Hello, hello. Good afternoon, everybody. So today's webinar, I want us to look at how to trade the major news events. There is one thing which I'm going to say, that there are two main types of news which I normally focus on. There are many others, like the rate of the employment, the rate of unemployment, and the rate of employment. But on this webinar, I'm going to focus strictly on interest rates and earnings. So interest rates of a company, and also the earnings of a company, and how they affect the price per share of that given company. So one thing which I like to say, let me share my screen so that. So on the other hand, if the interest rates are low, as I was saying, I just noticed that my voice was mute when I was covering this page here. I'm really sorry about that. I was covering the page on interest rates and earnings. So let me explain that. I'm not going to switch back to that page, but I'll explain that I'm looking at two things. I'm looking at earnings. At the same time, I'm looking at interest rates. Then earnings are just a company's earnings after after tax. So your net income after tax, that becomes your earnings. And interest rates is the amount that the borrower charges for loaning you, for giving you money to start business. So I mentioned before that whenever there is a high interest rates, companies tend to shy off from borrowing because it's like more expensive to borrow. So when when there's a company which depends on loans to expand themselves, if the interest rate becomes very high, the less likely they'll be interested in picking loans. So that will ripple down to the fact that they can now not expand themselves as usual because the loans are very expensive. But if the loans are very high, if the interest rate is very low, the more the borrowing and the more the expansion and the more the oversupply of something. So the more they expand, the more their foundation, like the more assets they'll begin to have because they receive more money. So any news which involves interest rates is of great impact to the company concerned, to the companies that rely on interest rate, on borrowing, on money borrowed to expand themselves. So I'm not saying that there's some companies do not depend on loan. No, most companies are actually geared. Geared means they have borrowed money for them to do business or to remain in business. So any news which involves interest rates is of great importance, especially to those companies which rely strictly on loans to expand themselves. There's some companies which do not need loan because their earnings are way beyond, like their earnings are beyond, so they have to they can use the earnings on its own to expand themselves and also to pay dividends and also do other things. But if a company's earnings are not very high, and at the same time they depend on earnings to they depend on earnings to expand themselves, then they may opt to pick a loan for them to expand themselves. So that's what interest rates and earnings mean. As I've said, interest rates is the amount charged by the borrower to borrow money from him. Earnings is the net income after tax. So maybe the tax is 15% or whichever your government picks for you. The remaining that becomes your earnings. If the earnings is not good enough, then you may opt for borrowing, especially if you need to expand, but the earnings are not giving you the room to do that. And the other thing, as I've just said, so the other thing, just as I've said, is that any news which involves interest rates, don't just be quick to enter trades based on such a news. If they say that the interest rates are high, the Feds are increasing the interest rates, or whatever, anything, don't just enter trades on any symbol just because of that. No. Look for those companies that are affected by the interest, those companies that rely on borrowing for them to expand. Look for those companies and then trade them in relation to what the news says. So if the news says the interests have been expanded from maybe 5 to 10, the loans have become expensive. So when it's expensive, it means you're going to borrow less. Borrowing less means that less expansion for those companies. So when we are borrowing less and rely on borrowing to grow, there is no growth when the interest rate increases. But if the interest rates are very low, you hear that, okay, the Feds have reduced the interest rate from maybe 5 to 2, or if that's possible, or maybe from 10 to 4, if that is possible. If they do that, and you know that there are companies which rely on borrowing to expand themselves, immediately go to those companies websites, try to find information, try to check if at that given time they actually want to expand. If that is true, then you go ahead and purchase their shares at that time, because likely after the borrowing they'll expand themselves and the more expensive they become. So borrowing is really good in this case. A case where it's bad is when the company needs to expand and the loans are very expensive. So if you hear that there's a company which it's almost doing everything to raise money for themselves, and at the same time you hear that the interest rates are all of a sudden shooting, or you hear rumors that the company is declaring itself bankrupt, then that is the best time to step out if you had shares of that company. So that's what I wanted to cover. What I wanted to make clear today is that whenever you hear news concerning interest rates and earnings, you have to be very careful, because they're somehow correlated. There's something which links both of them. That is, if a company earns enough, there is no need for focusing so much on interest rates unless they want to borrow money. But if a company earns less, the interest rate also becomes important because they have to know exactly how much they're going to be charged for borrowing. For instance, assuming we have Zoom, their earnings are maybe, I'm not saying that's the case, assuming their earnings are not enough to sustain themselves or to expand themselves. So they opt to borrow money, then suddenly you hear that the Feds have increased the interest rate to 10%. That will directly affect their appetite for borrowing. It will directly bring them to some control, which is not necessary. So in such a case, there is no way they'll borrow money because it has become very expensive. The earnings are not enough already. The interests are also very, very expensive. So the appetite for borrowing has become very less, which means they'll not borrow that money, they'll not expand, and their share price is also likely to decrease. So that's where the correction comes in. Another thing is assuming Zoom has enough money to sustain, or the earnings are very, very good, that they literally are paying good dividends. Then for their shareholders, they're paying very, very good dividends for their shareholders. The less the appetite for borrowing, because that way they'll have enough money. So whatever is advertised as the new interest rates, that will not concern, because the earnings are enough for them to expand themselves. So in such a case, even if they say that the interests have decreased or increased, you're likely to see a similar trend on Zoom shares, unless they announce clearly that they want to borrow because of this or that. I hope that makes sense. And that should bring us to the end of today's webinar. We're going to meet again next week at the same time. Thank you and see you.